So Lindsay Clancy is charged with murdering her 3 children, ages 5, 3, and 8 months old, back at their home.
This week marks the trial of a case that happened 3 years ago. The murder of 3 children in Duxbury, Massachusetts, at the hands of their own mother. Her name is Lindsay Clancy. This is her story. To understand what happened in that basement, you have to understand who Lindsay Clancy was before it, because almost everyone who knew her says the same thing. This was not a woman anyone saw coming. Lindsay worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most respected hospitals in the country. Think about that for a second. Her job, day in and day out, was helping other women bring babies safely into the world, guiding them through the most vulnerable hours of new motherhood. She had built a career around the exact moment that would later come apart in her own life. The fragile, high-stakes window after childbirth, when a mother's body and mind are doing things no one warns you about, even a professional who spent years standing at other women's bedsides. Her husband, Patrick, was a physical therapist. By most outward accounts, they were a normal, hard-working young couple. The kind who post the occasional beach photo, who host the birthday parties, who look, from the outside, like they've got it figured out. They had 3 children in fast succession. Cora, born first. Then Dawson. Then, in 2022, their 3rd and youngest, Callan. 3 kids under 6 is exhausting under the best of circumstances. For Lindsay, by every account now surfacing in both the criminal and civil filings, the birth of her 3rd child was the point where something in her began to genuinely break down. Not gradually, not quietly, but in a way that would escalate over the following months into a full psychiatric crisis. To the outside world, none of that was visible yet. Neighbors in Duxbury would later describe the Clancys as a family that seemed, if anything, unusually put together. A young mother juggling 3 small kids with what looked like competence and warmth, a husband present and involved, a household that ran the way households are supposed to run. Photos from that period, the kind that end up in every family's phone camera roll, show birthday cakes and beach trips, and the ordinary, unremarkable evidence of a life going the way it's meant to. That contrast between the visible life and the invisible collapse happening underneath it is part of why this case landed so hard when it broke. It wasn't a family anyone had already marked as troubled. It was, by every external measure, one of the family's other parents might have quietly envied. Lindsay eventually extended her maternity leave from the hospital. She was, by her family's own later description, often overwhelmed and anxious in ways that went beyond typical new parent exhaustion. And unlike a lot of new mothers who suffer in silence, Lindsay did reach out. She saw doctors. She was prescribed medication. She was, by any reasonable measure, someone trying to get ahead of a problem she could feel getting worse. That's part of what makes this case so difficult to sit with. This isn't a story about a woman who refused help. It's a story, at least according to 2 separate civil lawsuits now working their way through Norfolk Superior Court, about a woman who sought help repeatedly, and about a medical system that, according to her own family, never fully caught up with how quickly she was deteriorating. Here's what makes this case different from a lot of what we cover on this channel. There's no mystery about the physical events of January 24th, 2023. What's contested is everything happening beneath the surface in the months leading up to it, and how much of it Patrick Clancy, or the doctors treating his wife, actually understood in time to stop it. According to a timeline laid out in the Clancy civil lawsuits, between October 2022 and January 2023, Lindsay was prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications. At one point, 8 of them within a single 3-week span. The list reads like a pharmacy shelf. Zoloft, Prozac, Ambien, Remeron, Klonopin, Seroquel, Trazodone, Valium, amitriptyline. Medications meant to treat depression, anxiety, and insomnia, prescribed by multiple different providers who, according to the lawsuits, weren't fully coordinating with each other. The suits describe this as polypharmacy, a fragmented approach where no single doctor had a complete picture of how fast Lindsay's condition was actually moving, or how those drugs might be interacting with each other and making things worse. Medical experts note that combinations like these can, in some patients, increase serotonin activity to dangerous levels, contributing to agitation, confusion, insomnia, and, in rare cases, psychomotor impairment. Symptoms that can look, to an outside observer, indistinguishable from the underlying illness they're meant to be treating. There's a particular cruelty buried in that overlap. A medication prescribed to calm anxiety can, in the wrong combination, produce more agitation. A drug meant to help someone sleep can, layered onto 4 or 5 others, produce the kind of foggy, disoriented confusion that makes it even harder for a doctor in a follow-up appointment to tell whether they're looking at a worsening illness or a medication side effect. According to the civil filings, that's essentially what happened to Lindsay over those 3 months. A moving target that kept outrunning the people trying to treat it, made harder to hit by the very tools being used to try. Lindsay's own account, laid out in her civil complaint, is that she was hospitalized more than once in those months, that she reported intrusive thoughts to her providers, thoughts she says were misread as garden variety postpartum anxiety, when according to her lawsuit, they were actually the early edge of auditory hallucinations. Her legal team argues her providers should have recognized signs of bipolar disorder with postpartum onset and treated her accordingly. Instead, she says, she kept being moved through new medications, new diagnoses, and new providers, each one working with an incomplete history. Patrick's own lawsuit tells a parallel story from his side of the marriage, watching his wife grow more overwhelmed by the week, monitoring her medications as best he could, checking in on her mental state constantly. Publicly, he's drawn a hard line between the woman he married and the illness that took hold of her, a distinction he'd returned to again and again in the years that followed. By mid-January 2023, Lindsay had been discharged from a hospital stay and was back home. On January 7th, the family even celebrated Cora's 5th birthday, a day that, from the outside, looked like any other. Patrick continued asking how she was doing, how she was sleeping, whether the suicidal thoughts he knew she'd had were still there. She told him, at various points, that they weren't. What she wasn't telling him, what he says he had no way of knowing, was that she was also, by this point, having intrusive thoughts about harming their children. That gap between what a struggling mother says out loud and what's actually happening in her mind sits at the center of this entire case. It's also, according to mental health professionals who study perinatal mood disorders, one of the most dangerous and least understood features of postpartum psychosis. The ability to mask, to function, to reassure the people around you, right up until you can't anymore. As one specialist put it in coverage of the case, the condition exists on a spectrum. A mother doesn't need full-blown hallucinations to be in genuine psychiatric crisis. Paranoia, confusion, or extreme irritability can escalate rapidly, especially layered on top of severe sleep deprivation. What's striking is how disorienting that spectrum must have been for the people around someone like Lindsay. Patrick wasn't a bystander. He was a physical therapist, someone with a baseline understanding of health and the body, married to a labor and delivery nurse who spent her career around new mothers. Between the two of them, they had more medical literacy than most families dealing with a crisis like this. And by both of their accounts, it still wasn't enough to see what was coming, because what was coming wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It hid inside ordinary-sounding answers to ordinary check-in questions. I'm okay. I'm managing. The thoughts are gone. According to the lawsuits, on the day before the killings, Lindsay saw one of her providers. The next day, January 24th, she says she began hearing a male voice in her head, a voice she would later describe as telling her this was her last chance to kill her children and then kill herself. In her own words from the civil complaint, she described losing all control, her body acting without her consent, simply following commands from a voice demanding action. Whether a jury believes that account, as a literal description of a break from reality or as something closer to an after-the-fact justification, is, in a lot of ways, the entire trial. 17 days after Cora's birthday, everything ended. January 24th, 2023 is the day the case is built around. And even though the facts aren't disputed, they don't get any easier to say out loud. In the afternoon, Lindsay asked Patrick to run an errand, pick up takeout, and stop by the pharmacy for medicine for their daughter. It was routine. The kind of small domestic request that happens in households everywhere, every single day, without anyone giving it a second thought. Patrick left. According to the timeline later laid out by prosecutors, in the window he was gone, Lindsay took her 3 children. Cora, 5 years old, Dawson, 3, and Callan, 8 months old, down to the basement of their Summer Street home. Using resistance exercise bands, ordinary equipment from a home workout setup, she strangled all 3 of them. When Patrick returned, the house was unusually quiet. He searched for his family. The bedroom door was locked. When he eventually made his way to the children and understood what had happened, he called 911. Officers arrived to find all 3 children unconscious, each showing visible signs of strangulation. They were rushed to area hospitals, where, over the following hours and days, all 3 were pronounced dead. Lindsay, meanwhile, had turned the violence on herself. She cut her own wrists and neck and jumped from a second-story window in an apparent suicide attempt. She survived, but the fall left her paralyzed from the waist down, an injury she still lives with today, 3 years later, as she sits through her own murder trial. There is no version of this chapter that isn't devastating. 3 children who should be starting elementary school, playing at recess, celebrating birthdays, are gone. And the person responsible for their deaths is also, unmistakably, someone who tried to end her own life in the same act, and who says she was carrying out the demands of a voice she couldn't resist. That collision, a crime scene that is simultaneously a scene of attempted self-destruction, is exactly why this case became so much more than a local tragedy. It became a national conversation. Duxbury is a small coastal town south of Boston, the kind of place with a population in the low 15,000s, good schools, and a reputation as a safe, close-knit community. In the days after January 24th, 2023, it became something else entirely, the center of a national news story, with satellite trucks lining streets usually occupied by nothing louder than a school bus. A makeshift memorial grew outside the Clancy home on Summer Street. Flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes left by neighbors and strangers alike for 3 children most of them had never personally met, but whose deaths landed like a blow to the entire community. Local officials described a town in collective shock, trying to grieve 3 specific, named children, while also absorbing the fact that the person responsible was their mother, still fighting for her own life in a hospital bed miles away. The dual nature of the tragedy, child victims and a critically injured, suicidal defendant, made it deeply difficult for the public conversation to sort itself into a simple narrative. Was this a story about monstrous violence against children? Was it a story about a healthcare system's failure to protect a new mother in crisis? Local and national coverage in those first weeks tried on both framings, often within the same article, because neither one alone captured what had actually happened. For Patrick Clancy, those days after were their own kind of unbearable. He had lost all 3 of his children in a single afternoon. He was, at the same time, the husband of the woman who killed them, and, as he would later make clear in interviews, someone who did not, even in the immediate aftermath, believe his wife was a monster. He would later tell the New Yorker that he wasn't married to a monster, but to someone who had gotten sick. That's a wrenching position to hold in public, in the same news cycle where photographs of his children's faces were being shown on television. Grief and something close to loyalty, sitting side by side, with no roadmap for how a person is supposed to process either one. National outlets picked up the story within hours, and it stayed in heavy rotation for weeks, not just because of the scale of the tragedy, but because it was, from the very first press conference, a story that resisted the usual true crime shorthand. There was no manhunt, no mystery about who was responsible. Instead, reporters found themselves covering a case where the alleged perpetrator was simultaneously a gravely injured victim, recovering from a suicide attempt in the same hospital system where she'd once worked, while a national audience tried to reconcile labor and delivery nurse and accused of murdering her own children as descriptions of the same person. Lindsay Clancy did not walk into a courtroom for her arraignment. She couldn't. On February 7th, 2023, still recovering in a Boston hospital from her injuries, she was arraigned from her hospital bed. A detail that, on its own, tells you how severe her physical condition still was in those early weeks. She was charged with 3 counts each of murder, strangulation, and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, 1 set of charges for each child. She pleaded not guilty to all of them. Judge John Canavan ordered that she remain at a medical facility to complete her treatment before the case could move forward in any conventional sense. Months later, she was ordered held without bail and moved to Duxbury Hospital to continue psychiatric care under the court's supervision. From nearly the beginning, her defense attorney, Kevin Reddington, signaled exactly where this case was headed. He described his client as a troubled soul who had been suffering from severe postpartum depression and who, in his account, had been over-medicated by the very doctors meant to be helping her. Within months, Reddington announced that Lindsay would pursue what's formally known now as a lack of criminal responsibility defense, the modern legal term for what most people still think of as an insanity defense. Prosecutors staked out the opposite ground early and never moved off it. That regardless of Lindsay's mental health history, her actions on January 24th showed deliberate premeditation. Not a woman who blacked out and lost control of her body, but someone who made a choice. 2 accounts of the same afternoon. One version has Lindsay Clancy as a mother in the grip of a psychiatric break so severe she wasn't in control of her own actions. The other has her as someone who understood exactly what she was doing. There would be no middle ground offered by either side. And that collision course is exactly what a jury in Plymouth County is now being asked to referee. Before we go further, it helps to understand exactly what Lindsay Clancy's defense is actually asking the jury to do, because insanity defense is one of those phrases everyone's heard and almost no one fully understands. Massachusetts, like most states, follows a legal standard rooted in what's known as the Naughton framework, developed from 19th century English law and adapted over time. In simple terms, a defendant can be found not criminally responsible if, at the time of the act, a documented mental disease or defect left them unable to understand what they were doing was wrong, or unable to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. It is not enough to prove someone was mentally ill. It is not enough to prove they were struggling or even suffering. The defense has to establish that, in that specific window of time, Lindsay's illness didn't just affect her judgment, it broke her fundamental grasp on reality. That's an extraordinarily high bar. And to be clear, defendants who raise this defense are not claiming they didn't do it. Lindsay's attorney has never disputed that she killed her children. The entire defense is built on the argument that the woman who did it wasn't, in any legally meaningful sense, in control of her own mind at the time. If a jury accepts that argument, the outcome isn't an acquittal in the way people usually picture one. Lindsay wouldn't simply walk free. A finding of not criminally responsible typically results in commitment to a secure psychiatric facility, often for an extended period, sometimes longer than an equivalent prison sentence would have been, until doctors and the court agree she no longer poses a danger. It's a different kind of confinement, not the absence of consequences. If the jury rejects the defense and convicts her of first-degree murder, the sentence is a mandatory one: life in prison. There is no scenario here that ends with Lindsay Clancy simply going home. The question this jury is actually deciding is which institution holds her, under what legal label, and under what theory of what happened inside her mind on January 24th, 2023. Massachusetts places the burden on the defense to raise a genuine question about criminal responsibility, at which point the burden shifts to prosecutors to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant was in fact criminally responsible at the time of the offense. That's a meaningfully different structure than some other states use, and it means the Commonwealth's psychiatric experts aren't just supporting witnesses in this trial. They're central to the prosecution actually meeting its burden of proof once the defense has put Lindsay's mental state genuinely in dispute. It also means the jury instructions at the end of this trial are going to be dense with legal language most jurors have never encountered before, translating decades of case law into a single question they have to answer about one afternoon in one basement. Between the arraignment and the trial, more than 3 years passed, and they were not quiet years. Court documents from this period paint a picture prosecutors clearly hoped would undercut a psychosis defense. Records showing Lindsay had used her phone and personal journal not just to document her declining mental state, but, according to filings, to research methods of killing beforehand. Investigators reportedly recovered search history and map queries from her phone from the days surrounding January 24th, including searches related to timing and logistics. The kind of granular, forward-planning detail prosecutors argue is inconsistent with a mind too fractured by psychosis to form intent. Her journal, meanwhile, apparently contained entries tracking her medications, her moods, and in passages the defense will lean on heavily, increasingly disordered, frightened writing about voices and thoughts she couldn't control. It's exactly the kind of detail that cuts both ways in a case like this. To prosecutors, it's evidence of premeditation, a paper trail of planning. To the defense, it's evidence of a mind spiraling into crisis, documenting its own unraveling in real time, the way someone might narrate a nightmare they can't wake up from. Both sides are, in a sense, reading from the same documents and arriving at opposite conclusions, which tells you something about how much interpretive weight this trial is going to put on written words that were never meant for a courtroom. Judge William Sullivan, who would ultimately oversee the trial, ordered Lindsay to undergo psychiatric examinations conducted by experts chosen by the Commonwealth, a standard step when a defendant's mental state at the time of a crime becomes the central legal question in a case like this. Those Commonwealth-selected evaluations would run alongside, and often in direct tension with evaluations arranged separately by Lindsay's own defense team, setting up exactly the kind of dueling expert dynamic that so often decides cases like this one. As the trial date approached, prosecutors made a notable procedural move. They dropped the 3 strangulation charges, folding that conduct into the murder charges rather than prosecuting it separately. It wasn't a softening of the case against her. If anything, it streamlined it. Meanwhile, outside the criminal case entirely, both Lindsay and Patrick filed separate civil lawsuits against the network of medical providers who treated her, including facilities like McLean Hospital, Women and Infants Hospital of Rhode Island, and a mental health provider identified in filings as Tufts at Astor. Both suits allege medical malpractice and, in Lindsay's case, wrongful death, arguing that a chain of providers failed to recognize obvious warning signs, failed to coordinate her care, and failed to properly diagnose what her legal team now says was undiagnosed bipolar disorder with postpartum psychotic features. None of the named providers have publicly responded to the allegations in detail. Jury selection for the criminal trial began on July 20th, 2026. 18 jurors were seated, enough to account for the length of what was expected to be a genuinely massive trial. Both sides indicated they planned to call more than 200 witnesses between them, and the trial itself was projected to run 6 to 8 weeks. Jurors would not be sequestered, but they were ordered to avoid all media coverage of the case and barred from doing any outside research of their own. A tall order, given how much this case had already saturated local and national news by the time they were seated. 3.5 years after 3 children died in a Duxbury basement, the case they left behind was finally going to trial. Opening statements began Monday, July 27th, 2026, in Plymouth Superior Court. Prosecutor Shannon Buckingham didn't dispute that Lindsay had a documented history of mental illness. What she disputed was the defense's central claim, that Lindsay was in the throes of psychosis at the exact moment she killed her children. Buckingham told jurors this was a woman who acted intentionally, rationally, and swiftly to accomplish a very specific goal. She went further, describing Lindsay to the jury as someone who, in private, could be controlling and meticulous. Someone who, in the prosecution's telling, struggled to bond with her own children long before January 24th ever arrived. Defense attorney Kevin Reddington took the opposite position, telling the jury plainly that Lindsay Clancy was suffering from psychosis when she killed her children and when she attempted to take her own life afterward. He reminded jurors that this was a young woman who, together with her husband, had tried hard to get the help she needed. And, in his framing, simply hadn't gotten it in time from a medical system that failed her at nearly every turn. Then came the first witness, Patrick Clancy. It's hard to overstate how strange his position is in this trial. He is the father of the 3 children who were killed, and he is also, by his own repeated public statements, someone who refuses to frame his wife as a villain. Prosecutors called him first, presumably because his account of the timeline and Lindsay's state in the weeks before the killings is central to establishing what she was and wasn't communicating to the people around her. But his testimony doesn't sound like a man out for vengeance. It sounds like a man trying to explain, in real time, on the stand, how he missed the warning signs of something he still struggles to fully understand. He described the weeks after Lindsay's hospital discharge, leaving on January 5th, attending Cora's birthday party on the 7th, and the ongoing conversations he had with his wife about how she was doing, how she was sleeping, whether the suicidal thoughts had returned. She told him, repeatedly, that they hadn't. What she didn't tell him, by his account, was that she was having intrusive thoughts about hurting their children. He testified that he continued asking, continued watching, continued believing they were managing this together. His testimony carried into the following day, walking the jury closer and closer to the afternoon of January 24th, including, according to court reporting, difficult moments where crime scene details and portions of the 911 call were read into the record, with Lindsay reportedly fighting back tears in the courtroom as her own attorney sat beside her. Watching a father testify in the trial of the mother of his own children they lost together, is about as raw as courtroom testimony gets. And it's only the first witness in a trial expected to run for weeks, with roughly 200 more still to come. That witness list gives some sense of how sprawling this trial is going to get before it's over. Beyond Patrick, prosecutors and the defense are expected to call the first responders who arrived at the Summer Street home that afternoon, the doctors and nurses who treated Lindsay's psychiatric care in the months before the killings, forensic experts who can speak to the physical evidence recovered from the scene, and, almost certainly, competing psychiatric experts. One set retained by the prosecution, one by the defense, who will offer dueling professional opinions on whether Lindsay met the legal threshold for psychosis on January 24th. In cases like this, that battle of expert witnesses often ends up being just as decisive as any single piece of physical evidence, because there's no scan, no blood test, no objective instrument that can definitively prove what was or wasn't happening inside someone's mind in a specific 20-minute window 3.5 years ago. It comes down to which expert and which account the jury finds more credible. We want to spend a little more time on Patrick because his role in this story doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories true crime coverage usually relies on. He's not a suspect. He's not an outside investigator. He's the surviving parent of 3 murdered children, and he spent the 3.5 years since publicly, consistently, refusing to cast his wife as a villain. In interviews given before the trial, including one with The New Yorker, Patrick has described watching Lindsay's condition decline in the months after Callan's birth, and has said he believes doctors and the healthcare system around her failed to catch how serious it had become. He's talked about a version of his wife that existed before the illness took hold, competent, loving, someone who spent her career caring for other families in exactly the kind of vulnerable moment his own family was living through. That's part of what makes his position so difficult for the public to sit with. The instinct in a case like this is to look for someone to be angry at, and the person with the most reason to be angry has, again and again, redirected that anger toward a healthcare system instead of toward his wife. That doesn't mean his testimony is soft on facts. On the stand, he's had to walk through exact details. What Lindsay told him, what she didn't, the precise timeline of a day that ended with him finding his own children. Prosecutors need his account to establish what Lindsay was and wasn't communicating in the lead up to the killings, regardless of his personal feelings about her culpability. He is, functionally, a hostile to neither side witness, cooperating fully with the prosecution's need for facts while remaining publicly aligned with the defense's underlying theory of what happened to his wife's mind. Legal analysts covering the trial have noted this dynamic could cut either way with jurors. A father who forgives, or at least refuses to condemn. The person responsible for his children's deaths is either a deeply sympathetic figure whose perspective jurors weigh heavily, or, in the prosecution's framing, evidence that even those closest to Lindsay recognized her illness didn't rise to the level of a legal excuse. Either way, his testimony is likely to be some of the most closely parsed material in the entire trial. There's also a quieter dimension to Patrick's role that's easy to miss under the weight of everything else. He is, in effect, testifying about the end of his own family in a room where the person he built that family with is sitting a few feet away. Whatever legal outcome this trial produces, Patrick Clancy doesn't get his children back, and he doesn't get the marriage he had before January 24th, 2023. Back either. His testimony isn't just evidence for a jury. It's also, unavoidably, the closest thing to a public reckoning he may ever get with what happened to his own life. Strip away the specifics of this one family for a moment, and the Lindsay Clancy trial is forcing a conversation the American legal system has never been especially comfortable having. What do we actually do when a mother, in the depths of a severe postpartum psychiatric illness, kills her own children? Postpartum depression is common, by some estimates affecting as many as 1 in 8, or in some studies up to 1 in 5, new mothers. It's characterized by persistent sadness, anxiety, and exhaustion, and while serious, it's a condition most people have at least heard of. Postpartum psychosis is a different category of illness entirely. Experts estimate it affects somewhere between 1 and 2 out of every 1,000 women after delivery. Rare, but real, and considered a genuine psychiatric emergency. It's described by clinicians as a mental health crisis that fractures a person's basic sense of reality. Hallucinations, delusions, a mind that can no longer reliably distinguish what's happening from what isn't. Treatment typically requires inpatient psychiatric care, sometimes involuntary hospitalization, and in severe cases, treatments like electroconvulsive therapy. Experts are consistent on one point: catching it early dramatically improves outcomes. Notably, postpartum psychosis isn't even formally recognized as its own diagnosis in the DSM-5, the manual clinicians use to code mental health conditions, which some advocates argue is part of why it's so often missed or misdiagnosed as something milder. Cases that escalate to violence, like this one, are exceedingly rare within an already rare condition. But when they happen, they force an uncomfortable question into public view. Is this a crime? Or is this what an untreated psychiatric emergency looks like when it goes catastrophically wrong? Legally, insanity and lack of criminal responsibility defenses succeed far less often than television and film would have you believe. Defense attorneys with experience in these cases have been candid in interviews about the odds. Juries are, understandably, deeply reluctant to accept that someone wasn't in control of actions as severe as what happened in that Duxbury basement, no matter how documented the mental illness behind it might be. Prosecutors know that too, which is part of why the Commonwealth's strategy here isn't to deny Lindsay's mental illness outright, but to argue that whatever she was experiencing, it hadn't risen to the level of psychosis at the precise moment she acted. There's also a broader systemic question hovering over this entire case, one that commentators have raised repeatedly since the trial began. Lindsay Clancy was a nurse, married, financially stable, with direct access to some of the best hospitals in the country. And by her own family's account, she still fell through the cracks of the mental health system. If a woman with that level of access and medical literacy couldn't get the coordinated care she needed in time, what does that suggest about the odds for mothers with far less access, far less money, and far less of a voice inside the healthcare system? It's a question that some commentary around this case has pushed even further, that framing what happened purely as a criminal matter, without also reckoning with the systemic gaps in perinatal mental health care, risks treating a public health failure as if it were simply an individual moral one. That doesn't erase what happened to Cora, Dawson, and Callan. It sits alongside it, A second, uncomfortable layer to a story that already refuses to sort neatly into hero and villain. Advocates for perinatal mental health have used this trial as a moment to push a broader message that intrusive thoughts, reported honestly and early, should trigger urgent psychiatric evaluation rather than being waved off as normal new parent anxiety. That coordination between providers, something the Clancy civil suits allege never happened here, can be the difference between a mother getting the inpatient care she needs and a mother being sent home with yet another new prescription. And that the stigma around admitting to violent or disturbing intrusive thoughts may be exactly what keeps struggling mothers from saying the one sentence that could get them real help in time. This isn't a case we can diagnose from the outside, and we're not going to try. What we can say is that the trial happening right now in Plymouth County is going to shape, for better or worse, how the next high-profile case like this one gets talked about by prosecutors, by defense attorneys, by hospital systems reviewing their own protocols, and by the public trying to make sense of a tragedy that resists easy categorization as simply evil or simply illness. As of this recording, the Lindsay Clancy trial is still in its early days. Patrick Clancy's testimony continues. Hundreds more witnesses are expected to take the stand over the coming weeks, and both sides have made clear they're not backing down from their positions. Premeditated murder on one side, psychosis-driven loss of control on the other. Running alongside it, in a separate courtroom entirely, 2 civil lawsuits are asking whether the doctors and hospitals around Lindsay share some of the blame for what happened. There is no verdict yet, no ending we can hand you neatly wrapped up. What there is a jury of 18 people in Massachusetts who are going to have to do something almost impossible. Look at an undisputed tragedy and decide how much of it was a choice and how much of it was an illness no one caught in time. Whatever they decide, it won't bring back Cora, Dawson, or Callan. It won't undo the 3.5 years Patrick Clancy has spent as both a grieving father and a husband who still, by his own account, doesn't see his wife as the monster the crime itself might suggest. And it won't resolve the larger argument this case has forced into the open about how a healthcare system meant to catch mothers in crisis let one slip all the way through in a family with more resources and more medical knowledge than most. We'll be watching this one closely, and if you want us to follow up with the verdict when it comes, let us know in the comments below. And if this is the kind of case that makes you think differently about how we talk about mental illness and accountability, about what it means to hold someone responsible for actions taken by a mind that may not have been fully their own, that's exactly the conversation we come back here to have, week after week. If you're new here, welcome to the Homicide Room. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.